You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. A new study published in the Journal of Medical Ethics suggests some paediatricians are concerned that deep religious beliefs are leading to some parents to insist aggressive treatment carries on, despite it not being in the best interests of the sick child. In a recent case at the High Court in London, a judge ordered that doctors can be allowed to switch off a young boy's life support machine, even though his devout Christian parents pleaded for him to be kept alive in case of a miracle. The boy's family told the judge they believed their child was still conscious and that there was still chance a miracle might save him. But the judge instead agreed to the hospital's request to withdraw the child's life support machine. Now, the authors of this new study, who all work at Great Ormand Street Hospital in London, say it's time to review the current ethics and legality of these cases. The doctors say religious beliefs are prompting sick kids to be given futile treatment and that hopes of miraculous intervention are causing children to suffer needlessly. Now, Dr. Andy Petros couldn't join us today, but here's a short clip of what he told me earlier.
There's no one particular group that has the right on true belief. All the religious groups, all the Abrahamic religions, we see Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and some of the newer sects of Christianity, they all have believers who, as you I'm sure are aware, they all have fundamental beliefs in their God. A couple of times here, as I say, that we see parents who are fervent in their hope and belief that their child will be restored back to the day they had the accident. And sadly, we will persist and try to get their child as better as possible, but sometimes it's not realistic to expect them to be back the day before, sort of thing. And maybe that's where the hoping for the miracle is coming from, the miracle of returning everything as if it never happened, as it were.
Dr. Andy Petros, the lead author for the Journal of Medical Ethics. Now, joining this discussion on religious belief in medical decision-making is Dr. Evan Harris, a member of the BMA Ethics Committee, Charles Foster, a barrister and fellow at Green Templeton at Oxford University, and Dr. James Boyes from King's College London. And on the phone is GP Dr. Antony Lempert, the chair of the Secular Medical Forum. Now, I'd like to ask you all the same question and hear your response in turn. Should parents be allowed to put their religious beliefs before medical advice? Charles.
It's plainly wrong that parents should use their children as pawns in their own game with God. If that happens, then it's wrong. But there are very robust mechanisms in this country to stop them doing that. The test is the best interest of the child. It's not a test which is limited to the medical best interest of the child. It's supposed to be a holistic determination. But the ultimate arbiter of that is the court, and there are very well-recognised mechanisms for referral of these cases to the court, for the judge to be the tiebreaker in the event of a dispute between the parents and the clinicians. So, of course, there should not be children who are allowed to carry on living in a way which is burdensome for them, so that the parents can wait unreasonably for a miracle. But I suppose there may be cases where a child's continued existence doesn't impose a burden, where it may be reasonable for the child to be kept biologically alive in order to make the parents feel better about the tragedy which is about to happen.
Dr. James Boyes, same question. Should parents be allowed to put their religious belief before medical advice?
I think that we're living in an increasingly secular age, and the idea of religion playing a part in medical decisions is obviously one which is going to cause great concern to many people. But I think that we shouldn't overestimate the degree to which this is occurring. And I think that if we're not careful, we end up putting too much emphasis upon the input of religion in this case. And it seems to me that the vast majority of cases which are put before families, more than 70% in this case, were dealt with in a timely fashion without religion entering into it.
Andy Petros did say it was a small report, and it is a small report in the Journal of Medical Ethics. However, of 17 cases, 5 led to 4 of the children dying, 1 left with severe neurological disorder. And this is a small number, but it does have a ripple effect. So, Dr. Evan Harris, the same question to you. Should parents be allowed to put their religious beliefs before medical advice?
Well, I agree with what both previous speakers have said, in fact, but I think I don't necessarily agree with the assertion that you put from the author of the report that something needs to change. I mean, the position is established in ethics, as has been said, that when you have a child who's not capable of making their own decisions, either because they're not of an age where they can judge best interest, where they're not competent, so-called Fraser or Gillick competence, or because they're unconscious, or indeed any adult who's unconscious or incapacitated mentally, the decision is intervention must be in the best interests of the patient, and that is a clinical decision in the first instance. And where the position is futile, then it's clear that the intervention, which may or may not be onerous, but the intervention is not, by definition almost, in the best interest of the child. And it's only where there's a conflict between that clinical judgment and indeed a second opinion, which parents will be entitled to, and the parental view, that on those occasions the courts must decide. And I don't think it's unreasonable, and I think it's appropriate for the courts on what we hope would be rare instances to be brought in, because the last thing you want is to have on a ward in a hospital is the sort of confrontation between sincerely held beliefs from distraught, often semi-bereaved parents and doctors who are trying to do the right thing as they see it. So I do think one can exaggerate that this is increasingly the case. It may be increasingly the case because although society may be getting more secular, religious beliefs may, at the margins, becoming more strongly held, and therefore there is much, and doctors are rightly, in my view, not just assumed to be right the whole time, and people are questioning. There's one other thing I'd say, is that in establishing best interests, as Charles said, you need to look at beyond the medical situation. You want to look at the views and perspective of the individual, and sometimes then you'll have to go to relatives to find out some of the texture around what the individual would have wanted, whether they had an advance directive, for example, in marginal cases or not, when we're talking about adults. But that doesn't mean, and relatives have to understand this, that the decision is being given to them, because it is not a decision for relatives. It is a clinical decision and a court decision if there is that conflict.
Dr. Antony Lempert, you're the chair of the Secular Medical Forum.
These cases are always extremely difficult and extremely fraught with emotion and difficulties in resolution. What I found interesting from the paper, though, was that the authors were clear that many of the parents had difficulties in agreeing or agreeing with the medical advice to switch off life-sustaining treatment. But the most difficult cases were in the very few cases where there were really intransigent religious views. So I don't think it is to overstate the case. I think they were simply pointing out what they had discovered and offering a few possible suggestions as to a resolution and a way forward, because they felt that it was certainly in nobody's interest for these protracted and frankly what they found quite futile discussions to go on for a long time. From the point of view of parental beliefs and children's beliefs, I'd certainly echo much of what's been said, and particularly what Evan has just said, in terms of the fact that it's very important to involve the patient's relatives in terms of understanding where the person comes from. But equally, it's very important not to make an assumption about a patient's belief simply because the relatives hold that belief, and nowhere more so where a child has not yet formed a belief. And these are difficult cases. And in fact, the GMC has recently discussed this in new guidance on protecting children and young people, which is going to come out, well, it's come out already, but it's coming into force in early September. And they've actually stated that it can be difficult to identify where a parent's freedom to bring up their children in line with their religious and cultural practices or beliefs becomes a cause for concern about a child's or young person's physical or emotional well-being. And these are precisely the sort of situations we're talking about here, where a parent is asking for something, potentially a miracle, and in fact they stated a miracle because that's precisely the terms in which some of these parents were stating it, which was against the team. It's not just the doctors, but often it's the whole team working with these people in intensive care unit who recognise that further treatment would be futile and frankly burdensome to the patient. And there is good guidance as to what to do there, and the families were basically digging their heels in and saying, no, our beliefs will trump that good guidance. And I think in those situations, the ultimate decision should always come back down to the doctors making the decision, obviously being guided by relatives.
Is this not, though, the medical profession perhaps taking too sterile approach, though, to dealing with families who are heartbroken, whose young children are lying on life support machines, and they are hoping against hope, as any parent would, for a miracle? I mean, that must be difficult to argue for and against.
The law is absolutely clear. You don't judge the best interest of a child purely by reference to the medical criteria. As I said, it's supposed to be an audit of all the interests, sociological, religious, etc., etc., etc. Of course, that's a very difficult thing to do, and it is commonly the case that doctors view these situations through a very, very narrow medical lens. So when we come to debate about these things in court, we often find that the doctors are particularly pessimistic about whether a child's life will be ultimately worth leading. The nurses, who are at the child's bedside a lot more than the doctors are, tend to be more optimistic. So you often have an alliance of the doctors on one side saying switch off, and the nurses and the parents on the other saying give this child a chance. Sometimes when we argue about these things, we find that looking at it in the round, the judge concludes that that narrow medical lens doesn't give the full holistic story.
Well, invariably, in most cases, and I don't know of the cases where there's a split between the nursing staff and the medical staff.
Well, the case of MB, a child with spinal muscular atrophy a couple of years ago, was a classic example of that, where, in fact, all the medical experts instructed independently in the case agreed between themselves that the child's life wasn't worth living. The clinicians on the ground agreed with them that ventilation should be stopped. The nurses and the parents disagreed, and the judge decided that their view was the better one. And that's not an uncommon situation when we come to litigate these things and look at the issues in perhaps rather more detail than happens in a multidisciplinary meeting.
My understanding was that the most common position is where the clinicians take one view and the family and possibly the nurses
that's absolutely right.
take another view, and the independent experts, whose duty is to the court, not to one side or the other, take one view. Then it usually goes with that view. So I think that case must be exceptional, because my reading was that you do get independent experts' advice on issues like the likely quality of life. But as I say, I think it's very important that and doctors understand this, that they can look at the prognosis, they can look at the quality of life, but they have a duty to consult relatives, in the case of adults in particular, to try and understand the values of the person concerned and whether they had values that would push in one direction or another. And many people do now, I'm pleased to say. I think it's advisable, have these discussions. If I was in this position, this is what I would like. And that counts for something. It's not determinative, but it counts. And that's why it mustn't be, as Charles has rightly said, purely a medical matter.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me to discuss religious beliefs in medical decision-making is Dr. James Boyes from King's College, London. On the telephone, Dr. Antony Lempert, chair of the Secular Medical Forum, and Dr. Evan Harris, former MP for Oxford West and Liberal Democrat science spokesman, and Charles Foster from Oxford University.
There are a number of religions which have very distinct interpretations about the supply of medical care, etc. I mean, the obvious one is Jehovah's Witnesses, and I wonder from your own perspective what your own take on this is and anything you've come across.
Well, it's not a symmetrical position, if I can go first. So Jehovah's Witnesses reject blood transfusions, and that is not a case of insisting on treatment, but it's rejecting treatment. Yeah. And if a Jehovah's Witness has the equivalent of a clear advance directive to state that even when I'm incapacitated and it would be life-saving, I reject this, then that has to be respected. Yeah. The situation we're talking about in this situation is where, let's say there was a religion that insisted on futile treatment. That would not count, because you cannot force doctors, nor should you force doctors to institute treatment against the best interests, even if the best interests are predefined, when it is futile. That's very important, and it's very important that we stick to that doctors should not be forced by autonomy to do something that they don't think is in the best interest of the patient.
Well, may I come in?
Yes, Dr. Antony Lempert,
thank you.
Practicing GP.
just to add to that, in terms of coming back to the Jehovah's Witness example, in terms of the autonomous wishes of an adult Jehovah's Witness patient, then of course their views should be taken into account. If they make an informed decision that they're going to refuse a certain treatment that may well lead to their death, then as doctors we're duty bound to make sure they're fully informed of all the consequences. But at the end of the day, we have to respect that. On the other hand, that's a decision that really, if it's being made on behalf of somebody else, and it's now well accepted in medical practice that an adult Jehovah's Witness cannot make the decision on behalf of their child, that their child should have withdrawal. It should not be allowed to have a blood transfusion, for example, which may put the child's life in jeopardy, because the primary principle in all these cases is the best interest of the child. And in these cases, the religious views of the parents are superseded by the medical and legal imperative to place the care of the child first.
Well, going back and answering the question directly, it's very, very common in this country for there to be litigation where Jehovah's Witness parents say, my child will not have a life-saving blood transfusion. And the cases are all one way. The courts are very ready to trump that decision and say it's plainly in the best interest of the child to have that blood transfusion. There are circumstances in which where intervention which is objected to by the parents will not actually save the child's life, but will confer on it another benefit, where the courts might say, oh, we're not going to order that that blood transfusion is given because it will have the effect of making the child cold-shouldered by the community, which in its wider best interest won't be a good thing. But the courts are very ready to say religion must not rule. The best interest of the child is the principle which determines what should be done or not.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me to discuss religious beliefs and medical decision-making is Dr. Evan Harris, former MP for Oxford West and Liberal Democrat science spokesman, Charles Foster from Oxford University, Dr. James Boys from King's College London, and on the telephone, Dr. Antony Lempert, chair of the Secular Medical Forum. In a recent case that I came across, though, in that religion does rule the wife's wishes that her husband, who is in a intensive care unit, doctors want to turn off his life support machine, but she says that he's reacted to the presence of the family and had sniffed perfume brought back from Mecca. So in her argument, the religious argument is stronger, that she so believes that her husband has responded to perfume from Mecca, that would win an argument against doctors who want to end his life on a life support machine, who think his existence is futile. And in the case of this report, albeit only 5 and 1 case had to go to court, there is still religious parents who still believe that they have the right to insist that their child, who is not even sort of awake, have the same religious beliefs as them, and that they should be kept alive in the hope of a miracle.
Well, it's not just religious parents who want to hang on to see if their child might have one last chance. Purely secular people are reluctant to give up the possibly ridiculous last hope. Yes, the courts are fairly commonly called upon to adjudicate in situations like that. As I said before, if keeping them alive for a couple of days to give the parents a chance of believing that a miracle might happen doesn't impose some intolerable burden on the child, then that seems to me to be something which it's not necessarily illegitimate to do. If it is interfering with the best interest of the child, then it's both unethical and unlawful to keep them alive. But in my experience, most of these situations can and are defused. They're defused by discussion, perhaps mediated by the imam or the rabbi or whatever. Very rarely do the courts have to get involved, thank goodness. And very often, what is really going on in the minds of these parents is, I don't want the blood of my child on my hands. I don't want to make the decision to withdraw that life-sustaining treatment. I wouldn't be able to live with that. And if the clinicians or the religious leader is prepared effectively to make that decision or guide them strongly down the road towards that decision, they're much happier about it. So a lot of litigation in this area occurs because...
But what about those 2 days, though, that you mentioned just in passing, the 2 days that the family... You could argue they're being pandered to by the doctors and the religious leaders, saying, OK, we'll keep your child alive for 2 more days so that you can hope for 2 more days that there's a miracle. And it's that futile treatment, then, that the child's not going to get better, it's not going to get worse. And are we not pandering to the religious parents or those wanting a miracle? And yet the treatment is futile. I think that's what the ethics report actually kind of pinpoints.
That's right, but the duty on the doctors have a duty to the relatives as well to treat them with sensitivity. So one of the questions is, how onerous is the futile treatment? If it's simply the continuation of life support with sedation, which it frequently is, I imagine, then that isn't onerous in itself. What's the problem is that it's futile in the longer term, and sometimes parents are wanting active intervention that would be painful or a burden on a patient, and if that's futile, then that would be inappropriate, or in fact make a condition worse if we're not talking about a terminal case. So most of these cases, it's not too much to ask for doctors to have sensitivity, as they do, towards the beliefs, religious or otherwise, and we're talking about religious beliefs, but as Charles says, secular people can have strong views about what should happen to their children. And it's only in those cases where they're demanding a burdensome treatment, and that's urgent, and the doctor's view is that this would be inappropriate, that's when it's urgent, and sometimes courts have to meet urgently to decide these things, but those cases are very rare.
Dr. Antony Lempert, I'd like to hear from you.
Yes, I mean, the authors have highlighted the disparity in approach between the parents of different religions, and I'm just coming back against the point about this question about fervent religious beliefs. I mean, I agree it's very helpful to involve religious leaders when parents are struggling, and it's very important to be sensitive and where it's not overly burdensome to actually, to not be too rigid in one's interpretation. But yet again, they did highlight that, and perhaps one of the what I read when I read the report was that one of the very reasons they wrote this report was because of the very intransigence of some of these religions, and they actually highlighted which particular ones they were, where there really was no room for discussion. They were unable to have a meaningful discussion. And what they proposed, and what I feel is really quite sensible, they were looking at a way forward rather than protracted, pointless discussions where they really weren't getting anywhere, because there was a common theme in this. They suggested a different approach where the presumption was in terms of obviously the child's best interests, and actually going to the courts sooner rather than later in cases where they felt they were likely to end up going to the courts anyway, so that you didn't end up with these awful, difficult discussions where really, which was distressing presumably to the parents and to the staff, and would often result in a situation where there was going to be a disagreement anyway, and to actually go to the courts and say, look, you make the decision, and at the end of the day the courts will make a decision one way or the other, and that's not to say that will always be in presumption of the doctor. It may not be, and hopefully the courts will take into account the parents' views as well, but just to resolve these matters sooner rather than later.
Charles Foster.
These matters can be resolved extremely quickly if necessary. You can get a declaration from a High Court judge on the phone in the early hours of the morning when the judge is in his or her pyjamas about the appropriateness of the withdrawal of treatment. So the system which the authors of this paper are asking for is already in place, and it seems to me that the cry is otiose.
I agree with that.
And it also seems to me that the 2-day time scales that you were talking about was actually a point that Charles raised, to saying, well, if it is just for 2 days, that's not really the end of the world, effectively. But I think what the report is talking about talks about when children could be left in limbo, effectively, for anything up to a year or more, with the serious implications, as Evan talked about, for further implications to those children, and also the knock-on effects in terms of costs and issues to do with resource availability for the patients who might be in the hospital.
So if parents choose to keep their children alive, should they then pay for it?
Well, I think that a civilised National Health Service should soak up as part of its responsibility to bereaved or potentially bereaved parents the costs of keeping a child who is not being burdensomely treated for a reasonable period, so they can get used to the idea of their bereavement.
You raise an interesting question about equity. In these sort of cases, Charles is absolutely right. The question of the funds, the cost of this is not significant. But there are cases. There was one, I think, a well-known Cambridge case where parents wanted further treatment for leukemia, which involved, I believe, a bone marrow transplant, which doctors felt, or a second bone marrow transplant, I think, which doctors felt was not going to be in the best interests of the child because the chance of it being effective, given the onerous nature, were not sufficient. And there was a financial issue because these are extremely expensive, and given the very small likelihood of success, the anticipated cost per gain, as it were, in life years was felt to be too high for the NHS. And so there were two questions there. Was it ethically right to do the treatment if the parents insisted? Whether it's private or public, doctors have the same ethical considerations. And then separately, if it is considered acceptable, is it something the NHS must do, even though it's children, even though it's cancer, which is quite an emotive thing for the media to get hold of, because politicians have pretended that everything is available on the NHS when it clearly isn't. Again, those cases are rare, and only in those cases might there be a distinction between whether something is available on the health service or privately.
It's not just the cost involved to the care for the individual's child, but the knock-on effect of what costs are not being allocated to other children who might have a higher, survivability case, for example. So I think that there is a multifaceted element to this, which I think we need to consider when we're addressing it.
Dr. Lempert.
Well, we've certainly heard from this end of the telephone, we've certainly had a broad agreement that it's not only the medical care of the child, but it's the views of the parents, whether religious or not. And I think we've just touched on this question of resources, which I think where there isn't a problem with equitable allocation of resources, then there isn't a problem. But it would be foolish to believe that these situations don't involve discussions about who's going to stand to benefit the most. And in terms there aren't unlimited resources to deal with, to care for people, and there are limited numbers of intensive care beds. And when treatments are regarded as futile, I don't think that it's helpful to prolong the misery. And sometimes it is painful. Some of these treatments, they could be regarded as painful. I don't think it's helpful to prolong that misery unnecessarily, simply because of parental views.
Finally, Charles Foster.
If it were the case that parents were insisting that a child whose prognosis was completely hopeless was maintained alive at vast expense for a year, resources implications would, of course, have to fall into the argument. But in most of the situations that we've been discussing, that's not the case. And if we're just talking about 2 days to get used to a catastrophic event, it seems to me that is a good use of public funds.
I'd like to thank all my guests, Dr. Evan Harris, Barrister Charles Foster, Dr. James Boys and Dr. Antony Lempert, for joining me, Juliet Spare, to discuss religious belief in medical decision-making.